about World War II, what images come to mind? Raise your hand if what came to mind had something to do with Europe, the Allies, or perhaps the Holocaust. Now, raise your hand if instead what came to mind had something to do with Japan, or their brutal war crimes committed across Asia. You see, those European events were taught in our textbooks, discussed in our classrooms, and remembered across the world as they absolutely should be. But World War II was not just a European war. While those events unraveled, a massive conflict was raging across Asia. A conflict that shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people, yet remains far less discussed in our very own classrooms today. And that matters, because the stories we learn in school shape the way we understand the world, and when entire regions of history disappear from our memories and our education, so do the voices of the people who lived through it. But to understand that story, we have to first go back even further. By the late 1800s, Japan had turned itself into a powerful nation, and like other Western nations like France and Britain, they also adopted the very same idea that shaped global politics: imperialism. Imperialism is the idea that a country grows stronger by expanding beyond its borders, controlling land, resources, and people. From 1895 to 1945, Japan spread across East and Southeast Asia, occupying territories from China to Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, and beyond. In just China alone, the war would claim 20 million lives, 200,000 women forced to sex trafficking, and 10 million Southeast Asians dying under Japanese rule in just 3 years. But these events remain almost invisible in our education. Entire chapters of suffering are compressed into a few sentences or are completely non-existent in our curriculums today. And when we study history, tragedies like this, they just become another statistic to pass the class. Millions dead, hundreds of thousands enslaved, and when we hear numbers that large, it's easy to forget that behind every number is a person with a name, a family, and a dream. So instead of another statistic, today I want to talk about one person. One person named Narcisa Claveria. In 1943, on the island of Luzon, Philippines, when she was just 12 years old, Japanese soldiers had invaded her village. They asked her father, "How many children do you have?" As 7 children lined up before the soldiers, the father replied saying 8, forgetting that one was away in Manila. And the soldiers accused him of lying, and then brutally tortured and killed him in front of his entire family. As chaos spread through the home, Claveria ran upstairs to see a soldier assaulting her mother, and her younger siblings trying to defend her with small sticks. But the soldiers just proceeded to brutally bayonet the young children. That day, she lost her family, and Claveria and her sisters were taken away to brothels for prostitution, where they remained for years, living in constant fear. And she was just 12 years old. 12, the age of many middle school students today. Old enough to dream about the future, but far too young to experience the kind of violence she did. And actually, her story wasn't unique. It's estimated 200,000 women alike were all put into Japan's system of sex trafficking. And ages ranged from 15, 14, 13 to even 12 years old. And like many other survivors, Narcisa carried her trauma in silence. Many stayed silent because they feared rejection or shame, and others simply believed that no one would have believed in them. Many died before their stories were told, and these women, they didn't just lose years of their lives, they lost their voices. Another example of Japanese brutality was the Nanjing massacre. It was where Chinese forces had taken over the Chinese city of Nanjing, and it's estimated over 6 weeks, 1,000 women raped and 7,000 people killed per day over the course of 6 weeks. And yet, despite the scale of all these atrocities, most American students never learned about them. In a study by Yali Zhao, she examined 8 commonly used textbooks used across America, some of which many American students here might recognize. Across all 8, there was no mention of 3 major crimes done by Japan. 1, there was no discussion of the Nanjing massacre, no explanation of the human sex trafficking, and no mention of any human experimentation done. Which means that many students graduate from high school knowing the history of World War II in Europe, but never understanding just how deep the war had shaped many others in Asia. Zhao also then surveyed 55 social studies teachers, and actually only 7 had heard of the massacre, and none of them had ever taught these kind of events in their classrooms before. Instead, the focus is usually on 2 events, either the attack on Pearl Harbor or the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both are important, but when those become the only stories we tell, thousands of voices disappear from history. Now, to dive deeper into some of Japan's atrocities, one of the most secret and disturbing programs was known as Unit 731. It was the Japanese Army's secret biochemical weapons program, and it was the place of human trafficking and human experimentation, illegal human experimentation. Prisoners were burned, frozen, infected with disease, and operated on without anesthesia, all while doctors simply just recorded this as scientific data. And as I was researching this, I actually had greatly struggled because I wanted to take a break because it was just so disturbing. And then I realized that this discomfort was what mattered, because history is supposed to help us understand the consequences of power, cruelty, and silence, and help us recognize inhumanity again and again when they appear in the future. Imagine what it was like for the people who experienced it, the ones who didn't get to take a break or close a tab. And after World War II ended, many people expected full justice. So the Allied powers established something called the Tokyo Trials, designed to prosecute involved Japanese war leaders. Several were prosecuted, 7 were executed, and others received life sentences. On the surface, it appeared that justice was being served, but some of its most serious crimes were left out. The activities of Unit 71 barely addressed, and Lieutenant Shiro Ishii, who led the program, was never tried. In fact, the United States and US General MacArthur had granted immunity to Ishii and the other scientists involved in exchange for their data. But why? Why would they do this? Well, this is because by 1946, the Cold War had began, and the United States was shifting its focus from prosecuting Japan to competing with the Soviet Union. As a result, instead of prosecuting the scientists, US officials had just taken the research for American gain, fearing that the Soviet Union might gain access to it first. But Unit 731 wasn't the only case. Actually, the main focus of the trials had been centered around systematic war crimes and crimes against peace. But systematic sexual slavery and sex trafficking and some parts of human experimentation weren't fully prosecuted under the category of genocide. And as a result, thousands of suspected wartime leaders like Emperor Hirohito and many others avoided harsh punishment and were allowed to return to their positions of power. And then As a result, this made thousands of survivors to completely lose their voices as these events were just dismissed and minimized. And to this day, in our very own classrooms, all of this history isn't being fully taught because history is not just about what happened, it's about what we choose to remember and what we leave out. And right now, since history isn't being fully taught, we only learn parts of the story. And the problem with that is that we don't just miss information, we miss people. People with names, families, and a future, and a dream that was never lived. People like Narcissa. But the question is, can we change that? I think we can. Because right now, we're the ones sitting in these classrooms learning, but we won't always be forever. We'll be the ones who decide to choose what gets taught, what gets remembered, and what gets left out. Because every story deserves to be told. Thank you.